Hello, welcome everybody. So my name is Colin, and I'm delighted to be here today with Shirley Cheng, and she's here representing her co-authors Connie Lee and also Gerard Prendergast for her recently published article, "Does Sadness Sell the Use of Negative Emotions in Fundraising Appeals? Fundraising Strategies for-profit and Nonprofit Organizations." And this article just came out in our first issue from 2025, the March issue of JAR. It's also available online as well too. Thank you so much for being here today, Shirley, to talk more about your exciting article.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome, yeah. So to start us off, for people who may not have had a chance to take a look at your article or know what it's about, could you just give us kind of a quick summary of, what it's about, what you're investigating, the methods you use to go through and take a look at that as well too, and some of the key findings as well.
Yeah. We basically just look at how people respond to fundraising appeal. And our idea is that right now, like currently, not only for nonprofit organizations engage in fundraising, for-profit organizations also have the effort, particularly in under the umbrella of CSR and social marketing. They engage in fundraising appeals. But what we see in the fundraising effort, but what we see in the literature is that when it was studied or it was investigated, usually people just assume, or the researchers just assume that these fundraising appeals are given by nonprofit organizations or just like not specified. And then we have this idea that people may respond differently. There are actually articles showing that people make assumptions about organizations based on whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit. So we started this investigation, like how people respond to fundraising appeals given by a for-profit or given by a nonprofit organization differently. And we reported two experiments in this paper. And indeed, there are some evidence that people do respond differently. So in experiment one, it was a simple design. It was a 2x2 design that we compare two different types of appeal. So one is like a factual appeal. So when you talk about, well, in our context, we talk about cancer patients, like children cancer patients in Hong Kong. And then we presented like statistics and like what kind of cancers are like common among children. We talk about these kind of like factual appeal. Whereas in other conditions, we gave a narrative that talk about a patient's like the kind of like the suffering and the hardships for the family when they go through the cancer treatment process. So both of them are like so one is factual, the other one is more like a narrative to kind of induce negative emotions, which is quite common in fundraising effort. And then there is another independent variable that we compare whether this fundraising appeal were given by a for-profit organizations engaging in some kind of social marketing effort, CSR effort, whereas in another conditions, the organizations was like purely nonprofit, is a charitable organization. It's like just paying attention to children, patients in general, right? So this is the basic setup, and then we show this like the four different types of appeals to the participants, and we measure their evaluation, basically how favorable they think that fundraising appeals that they are being exposed to. The effect is that for the nonprofit organizations conditions, we basically like conceptually replicated what is found in the literature. So the negative emotional appeals were evaluated more positively than the factual appeal. But we find the reverse for-profit organizations. So basically, people actually evaluated the factual appeal more positively than the negative emotional appeal. Yeah, so that's the experiment one. And then we also had another findings for the experiment is that we measure how difficult they feel processing information about the appeal. So it's a processing fluency measure, but it's subjective. So we asked them how difficult, how easy was it when they process the information we gave them. Basically, the effect that I just reported regarding the favorability of the appeal was like at least partially mediated by how difficult or easy they feel about processing information that we gave them, right? So it gives some evidence that the underlying mechanism is that people feel that it's harder for them to process more emotional appeal when it was given by a for-profit organizations than for a non-profit organization. So that's experiment one. And
That's
then,
interesting.
yeah.
Do you think it's like a mismatch between like people are confused that it's like, you know, getting that emotional appeal from like a for-profit company, or like what do you think is
Yeah.
causing that lack of fluency? Yeah.
Yeah. Based on the literature, the paper particularly that talk about how people how consumer make assumptions based on whether the nature of the organizations. For profit organizations are basically being assumed as associated with being competent and not particularly caring, not particularly like warm, right? So that kind of information being brought into their mind when they perceive that this is a for-profit organization, and we think that could interfere how they process the the emotional information that are being presented to them. And that's also kind of consistent with how they report the processing fluency, right? They find it harder to process the information, even though like the people in the non-profit conditions, they receive the same kind of informations, right, about the appeal, but they find it to be easier to process, maybe because they have this warm, caring kind of association being brought into mind and being accessible in their mind that help them to process the emotional information that being in the fundraising appeal. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's experiment one. And then experiment two, we want to take it kind of like a step forward. And we use a different operationalizations about the appeal, that how much emotional information is being in the appeal. So in this experiment two, we had a different manipulation. So we try to manipulate how much negative emotions being aroused by the appeal. So rather than comparing factual versus emotional, we're saying like in both conditions is emotional. So this talk is about a child or multiple children suffering from cancer and then go through that journey. And the idea is that if they see multiple children suffering cancers, and then they think about it, they would feel like stronger negative emotions compared to they just see one patient. And that's indeed what we found in terms of like how much they reported, how much negative emotions that they reported. Regardless of type of organization. So regardless of whether the organization is a nonprofit or for-profit, so the participant who saw multiple children suffering indeed reported more negative emotions compared to when they saw in the conditions where only one child was being presented. So that's the basic setup. And our dependent measure was like intention to donate. So how, like whether or not they feel that they would consider making a donation. So remember what I said is that like the amount of emotions were as predicted as we manipulated. So multiple children conditions, all participants, like regardless of whether the type of organizations, they reported stronger negative emotions. But for let me say for the nonprofit organizations, we kind of replicate the same, like what we find in the literature, that the stronger the negative emotions that they felt in that particular conditions, that they also reported higher intention to donate. Right? So that makes sense, right? So you arouse stronger negative emotions, and people feel more compassion, a higher level of compassion, and they also drive their intention to donate. But in the for-profit conditions, we saw that although they still report more higher level of negative emotions, they feel more compassionate about cancer patients. but the purchase intentions, like they did not go up. Not purchase, the donation intention did not go up. It seems like they felt stronger emotions, but they kind of like hold it, or it doesn't drive their intention to donate. So that's the experiment too, and we find that it's very intriguing because that's interesting that they still report higher level of negative emotions, right? But it seems like they are more like regulating it and not responding to it, or when they consider their donations, it was not driven as much by their emotions that they were feeling compared to when they were exposed to like a non-profit organizations giving them the same fundraising appeal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah. So many questions kind of come to mind for me for that, Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. So I guess I mean, maybe we should just jump to that, but like, what do you think's driving that? Like, I mean, I know it kind of goes beyond your study, but like, what are some of the things you think might be causing that to happen? Is it just that disfluency, or is it that they think that the companies have a bunch of money and that they don't need as much money? Or is it like other different attributions you think might be kind of driving?
There could be multiple mechanisms driving it. Of course, just for the experiments that we reported, we don't have much insight into it, right? But there could be a few speculations, right? One could be like people being skeptical toward for-profit organizations, like try to arouse negative emotions in people. Then people may resist it. They may like have second guessing, and they
almost like persuasion knowledge activation or something.
Yeah, they may have the psychological resistance toward that, and they don't want to be manipulated in that sense. It could be one. The other one is that it could be the for-profit organizations, because the association is about competence and being like profit-driven, or like more rational, in a sense that it may arouse, how to say, it may prime in terms of like this procedural knowledge, that you don't make decisions based on your feelings when you are exposed to this schema of for-profit organizations, like being rational, being like you need to be smart and clever and make decisions based on reasoning rather than based on emotions. This could be another one. That and other mechanisms that we think it could be at play.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, and obviously a nice sort of, entree into like new research as well too. Yeah. So I guess the big one we're like always interested to like take a look at is, what does this mean for advertisers? And does it mean advertisers, like for-profit ones, shouldn't be using emotional appeals in these cases, or is there nuance to that? I'm curious as to what your thoughts are in terms of advice for advertisers.
Yeah, if we just like take the experiments findings and then try to like apply to it, of course, first is like we have to be aware of it can backfire. So especially for companies who are engaging in CSR effort, and or agencies who are making like campaign, or for companies, they should be aware of this possibility of like using like backfire when they use negative emotions. They try to arouse negative emotions in their fundraising effort. And maybe like from study one, we know that less emotional presentations, or maybe factual presentations, would be a better way to do that, right? So that's like one direct applications that we I think practitioners should be aware of. Second is that we do have some evidence about this fluency in the experiment one, right? If the whole mechanism is driven by this fluency, meaning the message itself is emotional, a lot of emotional information, but for-profit organizations bring in all kind of like being rational and being competent, that kind of associations. There is almost like a clash in their processing. If this is the case, then advertisers should be aware of these mechanisms and maybe think of ways to mitigate it, at least like from a conceptual perspective, right? Although we don't have empirical evidence for that, but based on this conceptual mechanisms, and maybe use a separate microsite, for example, like don't attach the whole fundraising appeal to the corporate site, the corporate website, or that could be like perceived to be like competent and like big scale kind of thing, but use more like a remote, like a microsite in fundraising. That could be one way to kind of mitigate that. Or when in the fundraising appeals, try to emphasize the warm side of the brand, like how the brand has been engaging in fundraising effort, CSR effort, like try to like highlight that part, the warmth and altruistic side of the company, not so much about the competent side and efficiency side of the company in the fundraising effort. Because sometimes advertiser may not have the choice, right? Especially when the fundraising is about like natural disasters, for example, right?
Yeah.
There is not so much like a good way to present it. Of course, then you talk about the factual, like the amount of help and the scale of the problem. Yeah, that can be, but there is inherently some negative feeling that's being aroused by this particular incident, right? So from this fluency mechanisms that we have some evidence about, then we can like kind of like indirectly derive conceptually what company or advertiser can do to kind of mitigate that clash in fluency. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder, do you think that like the style of the advertisement, I'm guessing like visuals might be easier to process than like text, for instance, other things like that. Do you think that might be a factor as well too,
Oh,
in sort of easing?
that would be a very good like further future research directions, right? So because in this particular study, we didn't really compare like the presentation of it. We didn't
Right,
have
right.
design the difference. Yeah, it could be like what kind of visuals that you present to the audience, like how much emotions there is, right, in the
Yeah.
visual can really influence how these information is being processed.
It's cool. Yeah, we'll sign up a good study when there's lots of ideas that come from it. So,
Yes.
speaking of ideas, I'm curious. I like always finding this out. Like, where did this idea come from? Was it somebody who saw this, or you came to you one day when you're looking at ads or something?
Oh,
Or I'm always curious about the story.
yeah,
Yeah.
Connie, who initiated it, she was a PhD student at the time, actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
and she has always been interested in emotion regulations. Like she is all about this side of the this particular stream in research. And then she read that article. We just talked about like Jennifer Arcus and colleagues' article in JCR, published in year 2010 about the firm stereotypes of nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And then she read that article. She started to wonder like, wow, how does that stereotype that being brought to mind affect how people process emotional information? Yeah. And then Gerard and I have always been interested in CSR, in particular, like social responsibility issues in marketing. So we kind of like combined these two. I think we thought that it would be a very good context to test some of her idea that firm stereotypes affecting how people respond to or process emotional informations, and that kind of like how it all started.
It's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious as well too about challenges. I think something I always say is I think especially for me and I think many younger scholars, we kind of see these polished papers like yours that come out that look fantastic and are very cleanly presented, and it sometimes masks like how much challenge there can be involved in getting research out. And so I'm curious if any challenges at all were faced by you and your team in this project, and if so, what those were. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing we faced was the external validity of the appeal, like the manipulations, right? In experiment one, we kind of compare factual appeal versus emotional appeal. So on how to say, you when you look at it, you see there is this validity. There is very clear negative, like the factual appeal and then the emotional appeal. And then and that's easy to relate, and it has a little bit higher external validity in the sense that
Right.
you can really see these things happening in the real world. There's different kind of appeals. But then when we started to do the experiment too, we see, of course, there are weakness in the design for experiment one, right? Because there are just so many things different between that two appeals. So it can be a lot of things. So we try to like modify the appeals, modify the manipulations, and make it like internally more valid in terms of like let's control so like as many things as we can, and just like how do we kind of manipulate a stronger level, a lower level of negative
Yeah.
emotion. So we kind of took this project to a more like theoretical directions. We want to test the theory, so we use like one child versus multiple children's in the appeals of the experiment too, and then even that we were thinking like, was it really valid, right? What does it mean in the real world, right? It's one step more remote from what the appeals we see in the real world. And but that's kind of like a choice like for us, because we want to make sure that our conceptual models is like is there, is solid, the findings is solid in terms of the conceptual validity of it. And then we worry about later like what does it mean for practitioner, what does it mean for anyway. But we strongly believe that if it is conceptually valid, like when we test the concept and theory rigorously, then that theory or that mechanisms can be applied, although not directly using the appeals that we use in the experiment. But as long as we have a stronger confidence in the relationship so of the variables, then the applications will follow, and that's a way to make findings useful, right? Is to make sure that the conceptual vigor is there and the internal validity is there. So that was the challenge. The challenge is that do we take it more external like validity and generalizability, or we take it like internal validity and test it using a more like a, you may say weird, right? Because we don't see these things in the real world, but we try to find ways to test it like conceptually like stronger and better. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that makes sense. It's a
yeah,
classic kind of tension between those two, right? And I always
yeah,
remember learning that there's no perfect single study, right? It's always like the best is kind of having a series of different studies and even different articles that kind of test and explore stuff from different perspectives and highlight different things and focus on different aspects of internal or external validity and things like that.
yeah. Then another challenge that we had, we kind of try to look at um other aspect of the effect. So we did run some studies about like not just evaluation of the appeal, not just donation intention, but we also ran a study to ask them about like recall, like do you recall better
Mm,
or not as good? Because processing should influence how much you
right.
encode and recall and remember, right? We do have some findings there. And then, of course, then the next question is like, do we take it further? Do we test it like one more time? And then how to take this project like forward is another thing. That's also the DV that we had. And then we also had reaction time,
Hmm.
kind of like we want to probe into reaction times, like if they were not fluent, sorry, processing fluency is compromised, and yeah, then maybe they would take longer to react to some kind of like appeal. Yeah, so the challenge is like how to shape and tell a consistent and compelling story in a paper.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's tough too. You're packaging it and what to put together and how to present it in the most, clear and like meaningful way, right? Especially
yeah,
because we have tighter articles or shorter as well, right? So it's always tough.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. So, and finally, just to kind of round out, I know we've talked about a lot of ideas already, but are there any other ideas that you think would be really kind of fruitful for people to look at in terms of future research around this topic?
Yeah, I think the big question, of course, $1 million questions is if compassion doesn't drive donation as much when the fundraiser is a for-profit organization, like what's driving it, right? What
Right.
is driving the calculation or the decision-making process? Do consumers really are they really more rational, right? Or they want to be more rational in the donation decisions, right? So that's something I can think of, right? If they are being primed by these for-profit organizations to be more rational, to be more like more cost and benefit kind of calculations in the decision in the calculations whether the decisions whether to donate, then it speaks to a very different process, right?
Yeah,
So
that's true.
then fundraisers or advertisers should go another route, like a totally different route, like talk about scale, talk about efficiency, talk about um, how much impact you can make with the dollar that you donate, right? This should be the way to go if this makes sense, like conceptually, like and
Yeah,
theoretically, it makes sense, especially for companies who have very strong, like that kind of rational image, like
competent, yeah.
yeah, if they have a very strong association with competence, if their brand personality is about sophistication and professional, like
Mm,
that kind of branding, maybe that is the way. I think it is. It will be very useful as well. Like this
right.
research, where if the findings really speak to that, it could be very concrete suggestions and implications for petitioners to how to
Yeah,
shape their appeals and how to go forward. We know that for profit organizations, especially corporations who are doing very well, they engage in CSR. So basically, the more competent corporations engage in CSR, right? It's not new. I think there are articles in the literature saying that there is a clash in there, and consumer feel like either skeptical, like cynical, or they just don't know, like they just don't know how to process this kind of information. And so I think the one further research that I would like to able to conduct myself, of course, and also like I would like to see in the discipline is that like what is driving that donation decisions, like for when people see for-profit organizations like asking them to do donations and do all kind of altruistic helping behavior.
yeah, a very important question. I mean, I like how you framed it, $1 million question as well. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on. You've been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And again, I encourage everybody to take a look at her article, so Shirley's article, Does Sadness Sell? The Use of Negative Emotions in Fundraising Appeals, Fundraising Strategies for-profit and Nonprofit Organizations with Connie Lee and Gerard Prendergast. And again, that's in the March 2025 issue of JER. So thank you again for being on, Shirley. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your great work with us.
Thank you, Colin. It has been a pleasure.
Awesome.